week and a half ago, and yeah, right in the centre of town. I'll let a few people come in here before I start telling you the history properly, but I just also want to show you the garden a little bit. There's the Eildons. It's a beautiful garden, beautiful house. You can get in here, so happy. Get in here for free and wander around the garden. And the house is the property of the National Trust for Scotland, so they rent it out as a holiday home now, the NTS. A beautiful garden and house indeed, Kate. And while we're here, I'll go and sit down in a moment and tell you about the history of the house. But I just want to point out, for the moment, how the front door is raised up on these steps. I just want to point that out at the moment and show you that it's a lovely looking house, very well designed and built, with that raised step up there. So let's talk about. So I want to come here today as part of the HAPS History Challenge, and every day this week I'm doing a different broadcast about history. History of the local area, different places, different time periods. Oh, James. And today I thought I would come to this house, Harmony Hall and Garden, and tell you about the history of this house. Because it's one of the less pleasant aspects of local history. But not just local history, of Scottish and British and world history, in fact. Because this house, as beautiful as it is, has a very dark and unpleasant history to it. Hello, Senator. Welcome, everybody. This house was built in the early-ish 19th century. It's about 200 years old. Again, where's this house? It's in Melrose, the centre of Melrose, just opposite the Abbey. So it was built by a man called Robert Waugh, who lived here for a while. And he was a plantation owner in Jamaica in the early 1800s, up to his death in 1832. He died. And being a plantation owner in Jamaica at the time, he was a slave owner. So this house, beautiful house and garden, was paid for by by slavery. So he owned a number of slaves, and he exploited their labour, owned them, as far as anybody can be owned. He owned these slaves and built this house on their labour. Yeah, blood money indeed. So if I pop you down here, I've got some documents to show you about Robert Waugh and James Waugh and the plantation in Jamaica. So I'll pop you down there, I'll plug you in. And so I've been doing a little bit of research on the internet, and I want to show you some of his records, some of his legacy, you might say. So we've got his will here, about his will, and I've got some of the records about his plantation and about the slaves who he owned, and who he exploited to build this beautiful house. And remember that this is one house among many that you'd find in Scotland, and in the UK at the time, built from slavery, because of slavery. So Robert Waugh of Melrose, who died 27th December 1832. So the Abolition Act, which ended slavery in the British Empire, came in just the year after he died. But up to that point, he held slaves on 2 plantations in Jamaica. Jamaica is divided into 3 counties, and this one, and then each county is divided into parishes. And his 2 plantations were in Manchester Parish in Middlesex in Jamaica. And his will was what's called proven in 1837. In connection with whom a document on Harmony Hall in Melrose was prepared on behalf of the National Trust for Scotland. So as I say, this is now owned by the National Trust for Scotland. The document says that the house and grounds were built in 1807 for Robert Waugh, a local joiner or carpenter. I have to write notes. Printed off some notes. A local joiner who had made his fortune from the pimento plantation, after which he named the house in Scotland. So it's a rather ironic name to call your house Harmony House when it was built from slavery. In this will, Robert Waugh mentioned both Harmony Hall in Melrose and his property and enslaved people in Jamaica, but disposed of them in a separate deed. His main legatees of his property in Scotland were his nieces. Do you think? No, they're not going to knock it down. Definitely not. This is profitable for the National Trust for Scotland. This former slave owner's house is now rented out by the NTS as a holiday home, and it costs quite a lot of money to stay here because it's such a beautiful place. And they don't tend to publicise that when you're, on their bits of advertising, when they're asking you to stay here, they don't mention that it's a former slave owner's house. They don't hide it exactly, but yeah. His nieces, he left 30 shares in the chain suspension bridge. So we've seen, I've often walked across the suspension bridge, the Gattonside Bridge there. So he was one of the people who paid for its construction in 1826. He had 30 shares in it. And do you know the little house that's on one side of the bridge on the Melrose side? That's the toll keeper's cottage, or toll taker's cottage. Every time somebody crossed the bridge, you'd have to pay a toll, and then that would be given to the owners of the bridge, including Robert Waugh. But he sold the shares, or his will sold the shares in the bridge to be sold for the poor of Melrose. So he gave some of his money, some of his property to the poor of the town. And in his will, he identified his grandfather as being James Waugh, who was the original owner of the plantations in Jamaica. The Melrose estate. So he owned 2 estates in Jamaica. One was called Melrose, named after the town here, obviously, and the other one that was named Mount Nelson. Presumably it was named Nelson after Lord Nelson, who had recently won the Battle of Trafalgar for the British Empire. The Melrose estate in Manchester is shown against Robert Waugh, attorney, in 1816 and 17, and against Robert Waugh, estate of 1828. John Waugh of Melrose Pen had died in 1794, aged 46. And he had lived there since he was 13. So he'd actually, presumably, left Melrose and gone over to Jamaica when he was only 13. And he built up this plantation. Well, I say his slaves built up the plantation for 33 years before it was passed down to his grandson. And John Waugh, the grandfather of the builder of this house, died 1794, and he left £100 to his nieces, two nieces, and he left them £100, which would be today the equivalent of £13,000. So this is according to the legacies of British slavery, which you can find on the University College London website. If you can see the address there, ucl.ac.uk. So this is held by the University College London, and shows you about the estates of slaves. So he left, Robert Waugh, he left these two plantations called Melrose and Mount Nelson, and you can see here how much they were worth there. So Melrose, our shameful past, yes. Melrose plantation was worth £517, 2 shillings and 7 pence, and Mount Nelson was £2,530, 19 shillings and 3 pence. Which would be the equivalent, according to the Bank of England's inflation calculator, that would be worth today some £309,000. And with that, with the money that he made over the years, being passed down from John to Robert, he could afford to build this magnificent home. So it was worth £300,000, but he's built up this profits from slavery. And I've got here a list, or part of the list, of some of the plantations that were in the same parish, in the Manchester Parish, and so many of them have English or Scottish or Irish names. So not just the names of the owners, but the names of the plantations. So, for example, you've got Duncan Robertson, a very Scottish name, who owned Evergreen and Oxford and Knockpatrick and Coffee Grove. Isabella Rome owned Belfield and St Helens. William Rowe owned Old England and Epping Forest, and so on. And it shows here the numbers. The numbers show the number of slaves and the number of cattle held. So, for example, Mount Prospect had 89 slaves and 4 cattle. New Forest, owned by D. Scaife, had 196 slaves and 275 cattle, and so on. And we have a list here of Melrose plantation and how many slaves were owned, or owned in inverted commas, because whether you can truly own somebody, but let's say owned, number of slaves and number of cattle owned, going back to 1800, and the crops that it had as well. So in 1800, when it was owned by, so just a few years after the original owner died, his grandson had this plantation, and he grew coffee and timber and stock, that is cattle, and then the pasture and wainage for the cattle. And again, it says here, this in 1817. In 1817, it shows you, as I say, the crops and the number of slaves held. 1817, number of enslaved people, 150 there, of whom 74 female and 76 male slaves being held in 1817. And that's the combined Melrose and Mount Pleasant. So Melrose had about 40 slaves, varying up and down a little bit here and there, new babies being born and old slaves presumably dying. up to 40 people and about 110, 120 people at Mount Pleasant plantation. So he owned some 150 or 160 slaves, and they would be working in the fields, growing the coffee, looking after the cattle, perhaps domestic slaves as well, looking after the family for some 60 years or so. Which is a horrible thought, really. A horrible thought, obviously. And it goes up to 1832 when Robert Waugh died, 1832, which was just 2 years before the Abolition Act came in 1833-34. When it held, in 1832, there was still 38 slaves living at Melrose Plantation. And it was finally disposed of in 1839. His will in 1839. So his will, so the records no longer mention the slaves. What happened to them? Who knows? They were presumably freed, but a lot of them would have been kept on as workers on the plantation in effectively a kind of slavery, an indentured servitude, probably. So when he came back to Scotland. Back to Scotland. He'd probably never lived in Scotland before. He spent his last about 12 years of his life living here at this house, at Harmony House, which, I mean, like I say, a horribly ironic name to call a house Harmony when it's been built by slaves. He was known locally as, he was given the nickname of Melancholy Jacques, because he never really left his house. He was an oldish man, in his probably 60s, but he went to a church and he was seen sometimes for local festivals, but he never really came out of his house. You wouldn't see him around town. He didn't have any friends. He just lived in his slave house. Why? Who knows? I pointed out earlier that the design of the house had the front door is set up on some steps, and that is in the style of similar houses in Jamaica. The front door is built up onto steps so the wild animals can get into the house, couldn't attack the house. And his house here in Scotland was built on the same design. So that suggests that he wanted to sort of recreate his house. He wanted it to be in the same style as the one in Jamaica. So he presumably felt some sort of a longing for Jamaica, but he left there to come here. Maybe he knew that slavery was on its way out, and he wanted to come back here rather than be stuck in Jamaica. So he came here a few years after he went. But why was he so sad? Why did he not leave the house? Was he ashamed? He left some of his money to the poor here in Melrose, but there's no record of him ever making amends for his slavery in Jamaica. It's impossible to know. He left, or his house eventually got left to the National Trust for Scotland, so it's not in the same family as it was. Maybe him or one of his descendants felt they didn't want this slave house anymore. Who knows? Who knows why? But no longer in the original hands of the owners, and some attempt was made to leave something to the poor of the local town, but like I say, nothing for the slaves in Jamaica. So although it's a very beautiful house now, and you can come and stay here, owned by the National Trust for Scotland, you can come and stay here if you want to. You can certainly come and admire it, admire the architecture, and know about the history, and admire the garden. Very beautiful garden, still obviously still very much kept beautiful, and it's sometimes it's the home of the Borders Book Festival. So there's a big festival held here once a year when possible, and people come, and authors come, writers come, and talk about their books, talk about, they give lectures and sell their books, and people come here every year and listen to a good positive cultural thing. But I wonder how many of the people who come here either as authors or as readers come here and know the history of the house, know that it was built by a slave owner and built on the backs and sweat and blood and tears of the slaves in Jamaica. So something to think about. And remember, as I say, this is one house in Melrose in Scotland, but there's plenty more throughout the British Empire. It's an open house. Well, you have to pay to stay here. You can't just go in. You can come into the grounds. The grounds are free to get into, and it's a beautiful garden. You can come in here and just enjoy the garden, but you have to, if you want to stay in here, you've got to pay the National Trust of Scotland if you want to hire the house out as a holiday home for a few days or a week. And like I say, I just wonder how many people who do that know the history of the house. I wonder that as well, to be honest. I know exactly what you were thinking of, by the way, vegan dough. How much? It's pretty expensive. I think I think there's accommodation for up to about 12 people, and if you want to hire the house out, it's pretty expensive. It's £1,000 or something for the weekend, in that region. Something like that anyway. So, I thought I would come here today and tell you about the history of the house. But like I say, this is repeated. I found out about this house. Right, okay. I found out. Well, yes, there is still slavery going on in certain countries, certain places. Yeah, modern slavery, but essentially just the same kind of thing as happened in the 1700s and 1800s. So I thought I would talk about this house because I could find out easily about the history of it and come and show it to you very easily. Where are you standing? You're showing us around. Well, I was a little bit before, but if I take it off the stand and turn you around, you can see the beautiful garden there. I'm sitting in a little what do you call this? A gazebo over there. I shan't show you around too much, but you can go back to the start of the broadcast. So I thought this would be a different and interesting kind of a history broadcast to do today, compared to the very different history broadcast that I'm doing. This important not to hide the past, absolutely. It's so what I have done and will do is told you about some of the other interesting places and interesting parts of the history of the local area. But very important, as you say, to not hide the dark and unpleasant parts of history as well. Equally important, important that we know that, and important that we get to see the more rounded and darker parts of history as well. And how this is happening, less than 200 years ago, maybe 6 generations ago. Not that long, really, when you compare it to certainly where it was yesterday, some 2,000 years ago. This was comparatively recent. That's nice. So I will show you, the rest of the week. I will show you the other stone. It's all whinstone that we see. It's in the same sort of style as has similar houses here. But as I say, if you go back to the start of the broadcast, you can see that. Or if you go onto my YouTube, you can see it there. And I'll probably take a few pictures as well, just to show you around and put them on my Twitter. Yeah, so I'll show you again other broadcasts this week. So we've been to a few places this week. We went to Celtic Iron Age Hill Fort yesterday, and we were at Smailham and Robert Abbey, and I'll go to other places the rest of the week. I do have YouTube, yes. Yeah, and I'll show you other interesting places. But thank you for watching for the moment. Yes, I heard a girl laughing as well. A few people over there enjoying the garden. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again tomorrow and somewhere else. Thank you for your comments. Thanks for being interested. Thanks for listening to the story of Harmony House. Yeah, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching, everybody. Cheery bye. Have a nice Tuesday, isn't it? Tuesday. Yeah. All right. See you later, everybody. Bye bye.